I never expected that a regular Tuesday night shift in the ER would unravel everything I thought I knew about fate, gratitude, and the cruel randomness of life. My name is Dr. Andrew Evans, and I'm a trauma surgeon at St. Mary's Hospital in downtown Seattle. I've been doing this for 12 years now, and I thought I'd seen it all. Gunshot wounds, car accidents, overdoses. The usual chaos that fills the emergency room on any given night. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for what happened that evening in November. It started like any other shift. The ambulance brought in a homeless man found unconscious near Pioneer Square. He'd been beaten badly, probably for the few dollars he had, or maybe just for being in the wrong place. His face was swollen beyond recognition, covered in dried blood and dirt. His clothes were torn, filthy, smelling of the streets. The paramedic said his name was Nathan, or at least that's what the other people at the shelter called him. No ID, no family contacts, nothing. Just another forgotten soul that society had left behind. I remember looking at him on the gurney and feeling that familiar weight in my chest, the same weight I always felt when these cases came through, because I knew the statistics. I knew that even if we saved him tonight, he'd be back on those same streets tomorrow. The cycle never really breaks for people like him. But that's not my job to fix. My job is to repair what's broken in the body, not in the system. So I pushed those thoughts aside and focused on what I could control. His vitals were deteriorating fast. Internal bleeding, fractured ribs, possible head trauma. We needed to get him into surgery immediately. My team moved quickly, prepping him, running the necessary scans. The CT showed significant abdominal hemorrhaging. Without immediate intervention, he wouldn't make it through the night. I scrubbed in, put on my gloves, and entered the operating room with the same focused determination I brought to every surgery. This was just another patient, just another life hanging in the balance. As we began the operation, everything proceeded normally. I made the incision, located the source of the bleeding, started the repair work. My hands moved with the practiced precision of thousands of hours in the OR. Around me, my team worked in synchronized silence, each person knowing exactly what needed to happen next. This was our rhythm, our routine. But then something unexpected occurred. As we cleaned the surgical site and I adjusted my position to get better access, I noticed something on his left shoulder. A tattoo, partially faded and stretched with age, but still visible. It was a medical caduceus intertwined with a quote. "To cure sometimes, to relieve often, to comfort always." That phrase hit me like a physical force. I knew those words. Every medical student knows those words. They're attributed to Edward Trudeau, one of the pioneers of tuberculosis treatment. But it wasn't just the quote that made me pause. It was something about the specific style of the tattoo, the way the letters curved, the particular shade of ink that had weathered over the years. A strange sensation washed over me, something I couldn't quite name. Recognition, maybe. But of what? I shook it off and continued working. We were running out of time, and personal feelings had no place in the operating room. The surgery took 4 hours. We managed to stop the bleeding, repair the damaged organs, and stabilize him enough to move to the ICU. By the time I pulled off my surgical mask and gloves, exhaustion had settled deep into my bones. But there was also something else, something gnawing at the edges of my consciousness. That tattoo, those words. Why did they feel so significant? I went to check on him in recovery. He was still unconscious, the breathing tube helping his damaged lungs do their work. Someone from our social services team had cleaned his face and hands, removing layers of grime and dried blood. And that's when I really saw him for the first time. The features beneath the swelling and bruises, the shape of his jawline, the small scar above his right eyebrow. My breath caught in my throat. It couldn't be. It was impossible. I pulled up a chair and sat beside his bed, studying his face more carefully. My mind was racing, pulling up memories from 23 years ago. Memories I'd buried so deep I rarely let them surface anymore. I was 7 years old, living in Portland with my parents. We were driving home from my grandmother's house on a rainy October night. I remember my mother singing along to the radio. my father laughing at something she said. I was in the back seat half asleep, clutching my favorite stuffed dinosaur. Then there were headlights so bright they seemed to fill the entire world. The sound of metal crushing, glass shattering, screaming. Then nothing. When I woke up 3 days later, I was in a hospital room. My body was broken in ways I was too young to fully understand. Fractured spine, punctured lung, severe head trauma. But I was alive. My parents hadn't been so lucky. They died on impact, the police told my aunt later. But I survived because of one person. A doctor who happened to be driving right behind us that night. He stopped, pulled me from the wreckage, performed emergency CPR right there on the side of the highway in the pouring rain. He stayed with me until the ambulance arrived, rode with me to the hospital, even assisted in my initial surgery. My aunt told me his name was Dr. Nathan Whitmore. She said he visited me several times during my recovery, always checking on my progress, making sure I had everything I needed. I only have vague memories of him from those hospital visits. The pain medication kept me in and out of consciousness. But I remember his voice deep and gentle. I remember his hands steady and warm when he held mine and told me I was going to be okay. And I remember the day he came to say goodbye before I was discharged to live with my aunt in Seattle. He sat on the edge of my hospital bed and showed me his tattoo, the same one I'd just seen on the operating table. He told me he got it the day he graduated from medical school, to remind himself of what really mattered in medicine. Not the prestige or the money, but the sacred duty to ease suffering. He told me I was a fighter, that I had a strong spirit, and that someday I'd do great things. Then he was gone. My aunt tried to keep in touch with him to thank him properly, but he'd left Portland shortly after. We never heard from him again. Sitting there in that ICU room, staring at this broken man who'd been living on the streets, I felt something crack open inside my chest. Could this really be him? Could this homeless man, beaten and left for dead, be the same person who'd saved my life all those years ago? The same person who'd inspired me to become a doctor? I needed to know for certain. I needed answers. I spent the next 2 days digging through every resource I could find. I contacted hospitals in Portland, searched medical licensing databases, made calls to colleagues who might have known him. And slowly, painfully, the story came together. Dr. Nathan Whitmore had indeed been a trauma surgeon in Portland. By all accounts, he was exceptional, brilliant, dedicated, beloved by his patients and respected by his peers. He'd saved countless lives over his 15-year career, but then something happened. His daughter, Emily, was diagnosed with leukemia. She was only 9 years old. Nathan threw everything he had into saving her. He took her to the best specialists, exhausted every treatment option, spent every dollar he'd saved. For 2 years, he watched her fight. And for 2 years, despite all his medical knowledge and all his skills, he couldn't save her. Emily died 3 weeks after her 11th birthday. According to the records I found, Nathan took a leave of absence from the hospital shortly after. That leave became permanent. He never returned to medicine. His wife, unable to cope with the grief and watching her husband spiral downward, filed for divorce a year later. And somewhere in that darkness, Nathan simply disappeared. Now I understood. The man who'd saved so many lives, including mine, had been destroyed by the one life he couldn't save. His daughter, the guilt, the grief, the unbearable weight of being a healer who couldn't heal the person who mattered most. It had broken him completely. And somehow, over the past 2 decades, he'd fallen through every crack in our society until he ended up on the streets, nameless and forgotten. He woke up on the 3rd day after surgery. His eyes opened slowly, adjusting to the harsh fluorescent lights of the ICU. I was sitting in the same chair I'd occupied for the past 72 hours, watching him, waiting. When his gaze finally focused on me, I saw confusion there, and pain, and something that looked like shame. I leaned forward, my voice barely above a whisper. I told him my name. I told him about the accident 23 years ago. I told him about the little boy he'd pulled from a destroyed car on a rainy highway outside Portland. And I watched as recognition slowly dawned in his eyes, followed by disbelief, followed by tears that ran down his weathered face. His voice was rough, damaged from years of hard living and the recent breathing tube. But he remembered. He remembered that night. He remembered me. And then, in broken sentences interrupted by long pauses, he told me his story. He told me about Emily, about watching her suffer, about holding her hand as she took her last breath. He told me how he couldn't look at another patient after that, couldn't put on the white coat, couldn't pretend to be the confident doctor who had all the answers, because he'd learned the cruelest truth of medicine. Sometimes there are no answers. Sometimes you can do everything right and still lose. And that knowledge had destroyed him. He told me about the drinking that started as a way to sleep and became a way to forget, about the divorce papers he didn't contest because he knew his wife deserved better, about the medical license he let expire because he no longer trusted himself to hold anyone's life in his hands, about the apartment he stopped paying rent on, the friends whose calls he stopped returning, the slow descent into a life he never imagined for himself. He told me about the streets, about the shelters, about learning to survive in a world that no longer saw him as a person, let alone as the doctor he used to be. We talked for hours that day, and in the days that followed. Not as doctor and patient, but as two people connected by a moment in time that had shaped both our lives in ways neither of us could have predicted. I told him how he'd inspired me to become a surgeon, how I'd gone into trauma medicine specifically because of him, because he'd shown me what it meant to save a life. I told him that every time I scrubbed in for surgery, I thought about that night on the highway, about his hands performing CPR on a broken child in the rain. That image had carried me through medical school, through grueling residency shifts, through every moment I'd doubted whether I was strong enough for this work. But now, looking at what had become of him, I also understood something I'd been too young to grasp before. Being a doctor doesn't make you invincible. It doesn't shield you from grief or loss or the terrible randomness of suffering. Sometimes the people who dedicate their lives to healing others are the ones who need healing most. And sometimes they fall so far that the system they once served can't or won't catch them. I made a decision then. I couldn't undo what had happened to his daughter. I couldn't give him back the years he'd lost or erase the pain that had brought him to this point. But I could do something. I pulled every favor I had, called in every connection, worked with social services and hospital administration to create a plan. We found him a place in a long-term rehabilitation facility, one that specialized in helping people recover from addiction and trauma. I personally guaranteed his care costs. Some of my colleagues thought I was crazy, getting so emotionally involved with a patient, but they didn't understand. This wasn't just any patient. This was the reason I was standing there in that white coat at all. Nathan stayed in rehab for 8 months. I visited him every week. We talked about medicine, about loss, about the strange paths our lives take. Slowly, I watched him come back to himself. Not the same person he'd been before Emily died. That person was gone forever, but someone new. Someone who'd been to the absolute bottom and found somehow the strength to climb back up. We talked about what comes next. He wasn't ready to return to medicine. Might never be ready, and that was okay. But he wanted to do something. He wanted his life to mean something again. Today, 2 years after that November night in the ER, Nathan works at St. Mary's. Not as a doctor, but as a patient advocate in our homeless outreach program. He goes to the shelters, to the tent cities under the overpasses, to the places where the forgotten people gather. He talks to them, really talks to them, in a way that only someone who's lived that life can. He helps connect them to services, to treatment, to hope. And once a week he comes to the hospital and meets with medical students. He tells them his story. He tells them about the tattoo on his shoulder and what those words really mean. To cure sometimes, to relieve often, to comfort always. Sometimes I watch him work and I'm overwhelmed by the strange circle our lives have made. The doctor who saved me became the patient I saved, who is now helping save others in a completely different way. There's something profound in that, something about how none of us really know where our actions will lead, how the life you save might one day save you back, how the worst moments can somehow transform into purpose if we're brave enough to keep going. I still have the stuffed dinosaur from that night, the one I was clutching in the back seat. It's on a shelf in my office at the hospital, a reminder of where I came from. But now it means something more. It reminds me that healing isn't always about repairing bodies. Sometimes it's about restoring dignity, rebuilding hope, remembering that every person on that operating table, in that hospital bed on that street corner, has a story. They were someone before circumstances broke them down. And with enough compassion, enough effort, enough refusal to give up on people, sometimes they can be someone again. I learned that from Dr. Nathan Whitmore, once on a rainy highway when I was 7 years old, and again in an operating room on a Tuesday night in November. Some lessons, it turns out, are worth learning twice.